Hello, everyone, and welcome to Polaron's Facebook live stream. As always, we are joined by our director, Eva Hussein, and our guest for this week is Ania Zamecznik. Anya is a writer, lyricist, and broadcaster. She currently works at the Polish Museum and Archives in Australia. Today, she'll be talking to us about growing up Polish in Australia. If you would like to learn more about how you can uncover your Polish ancestry, head to our YouTube channel for previous live streams and join us here weekly on our Facebook page for more videos and information. Over to you, Eva.
Thank you, Sarah. Anya, I'm so excited to have you as our guest for a couple of reasons. I think we've known each other maybe for a few years, and I've never actually realized how much you do for the community out there. And just in the last few minutes, as we were preparing for the session, I did get to know more. But firstly, tell us, where are you? And we can hear birds chirping. You're outside, right?
Yeah, I'm outside in the garden because when it's weather like this, then I just can't bear to stay in. So I spent a lot of time doing radio stuff inside where I didn't see the sunlight. And now it's, COVID has actually kept me outdoors.
And that's so nice to be able to get out. And, you know, in Melbourne here, where we're both based, we've gone through some pretty tough times earlier or mid last year. So it's good to be outside. Anya, tell us a bit more about your own background, because I know that you were born in Australia, but your ancestry is Polish. Where are they from? Where do they come from, your family? And what is the connection? And how come you're so passionate about your Polish heritage?
Oh, well, that's a really long story. My grandmother saw Poland through the bars of a train carriage as they were being wheeled across Poland from Belarus into Germany. So, and that was all my mum saw of Poland as well. They were born in Belarus in a place called Szanowrzątki. Took me over 10 years to find it on the map. And I found it through the our state library. I went to their mapping section and I said, look, I really want to find where this place is on the map. And people kept suggesting different spellings, different names, but it turned out that if they transliterated it into Senozhatki.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah.
Completely different.
Yeah, very different. And so I know now where it is on the map. Like, I knew the general location because my grandmother would always say that our family comes from the area of Rochachev, Mohilev, Żlobin, where Sienkiewicz wrote about Krzyżacy in this great big fortress. So the war caught them in Bychów. So they actually lived at the foot of Bychów Castle, and they were witness to the Germans dynamiting the castle in order to raze it to the ground. So my mum used to talk about these really thick walls of this castle, about 3 meters wide, and a moat that, like they said, 1 kilometer deep. That's probably an exaggeration, but it would have been a really deep moat on the Dnieper River.
And so were they sent to Siberia after that, or what happened?
The family was sent to Siberia, but not then. The family was sent to Siberia after the January uprising. So the men were given about 10 to 20 years each for participating in the uprising, and they were allowed to take their families with them. They lost their lands, of course. They could keep their lands if they converted to the Orthodox faith, but the family refused. They were staunch Catholics, so they
connection.
Yeah, when the sentence was over, they went to Warsaw, but Warsaw wasn't home, so they packed up and they returned to their old rubbish heap. Now, when Grandma used to say that, I thought that was a metaphor, but it turns out that they actually bought back a small parcel of their original lands.
Okay. And Anya, when you're talking about the January uprising, we're talking about 1864, am I right? 64?
Around about that time, yeah.
So you've been able to trace your family for generations, many generations, yeah?
Well, it's been a bit difficult because there are sort of blank spots. Several years ago, my mum and I put a little ad on radzima.org, which is affiliated with radzima.net. That's a Belarusian website. And I basically said, if anybody knows anything about families with such and such surnames, can they please get in contact?
Okay.
And one person wrote back and said, look, I can't tell you what's happening with your family now, but I can tell you about your ancestors.
Okay.
So Mum and I had a bit of a confab because it wasn't going to be free. It was actually quite a lot of money.
Okay.
But we decided to take the risk. And it turns out that the person that wrote to us, Evgeny Anishenko, was a historian who worked at the university there, and he lost his job because he was considered a Polish sympathizer. And the money that he got from us probably helped to keep his family running for quite a few months. And yes, so
when was
I
this?
knew some of it, and then I started
your family history.
So I tried to make it a little bit neater. It's very worn, as you can see. I do know what's supposed to be up the top there. So that the top part is Kazimierz Mickiewicz Żultek. This is my grandmother's family.
Yeah.
So
oh wow, that's really comprehensive.
And then I had to add
pages to the side, to the left and to the right.
It's actually, I've come to the stage where I'm going to have to get some software to help me with this, because this is just the Mickiewicz Żultek part of the family. And thanks to that, I also found a cousin in London that my mum didn't know existed, and she didn't know that we existed.
And Anya, how did this become passion? So tell us a bit more about you growing up in Australia, growing up Polish, which is the title of our session today. And I know that you've brought a few props and things that you wanted to show us, so we're very excited to see it. But what kind of atmosphere were you growing up with? Because your Polish is faultless, it's excellent, and it's actually quite rare for some. No, it is, because I heard you speak, so I can attest to that. And I know that you grew up in a Polish-speaking family, is that right? You spoke Polish at home? What was it like?
I didn't learn English till I went to school. So my grandma had 5 of us. My cousin Helenka was the oldest. She was a month older than myself. Then I had a brother who was a year and a half younger. And then we had 2 more cousins from my mum's brother, who were another sort of several months and then another year and so younger. And we formed a bit of a gang at school. So when my cousin Helenka and I started Polish school, my dad actually introduced us to the primary school teacher that was going to be in charge of us. And her father was Polish because she was from a previous immigration. So my parents came after the Second World War, and the teacher's parents came sort of even prior to the First World War, I think.
Okay.
And I'm trying to sort of locate this teacher now to sort of find out if she can tell me a bit more about her family, because I just remember she was so lovely. And there was a couple of Czechs as well who lived not far away from us. And Rowan Bray, he was in my and Helenka's class, and we could all understand each other because his Czech and our Polish were quite similar.
Right. So you grew up in a Polish family, Polish-speaking family at home, and it sounds like the school had your cousins and other people from similar sort of backgrounds. But when did searching for your family heritage or for your roots become a passion? What happened?
It always was a passion. One of the main things was that my grandmother lost most of her family in 1937 in the Polish operation by the NKVD. So all the men, I think Grandma said between the ages of 8 and 80, were arrested and a lot of them were never heard from again, including her husband.
Mm-hmm.
So after the war ended, they were writing to the Red Cross and wherever they could think of to try and find out what happened to him. And the Red Cross was just saying, we're getting no cooperation from the Soviet authorities. We're getting no cooperation from the Soviet authorities. Then after the Bud Arolsen archives went on the internet, I also wrote to the Bud Arolsen archives. And again, there was no cooperation. So they couldn't tell me anything. Because there's been a lot of research into that operation over the past few years, and because of the COVID lockdowns, a lot of the lectures have gone online.
Yes.
And I started writing to the professors who were giving these lectures saying, okay, can you give me some more information here? And this is who I'm looking for.
Mm-hmm.
And a while ago, one of them wrote back and he actually gave me a link to the Memorial website, which is a Russian website, where they publish the victims of the Stalinist era. So I found out the date of my grandfather's execution.
Oh, wow.
And just recently, I also have a photograph of the mass grave where he is most likely buried.
That's incredible. And that's in 1937.
That's in 1937.
Mm-hmm.
My grandmother was constantly writing to whoever she could think of, including, I think it was Stalin's wife, who was quite often helping Polish people. And, you know, she was writing to her also to try and get work because once he was arrested, then she lost her job and she had 3 little kids to feed and a sister who was a cripple. And it was very important for my mother to find out what happened to her father.
Did she remember her dad, your mum, or not?
Yes, she did. She was the oldest. Mm-hmm. So she would have been about 8, 9 years old when he was taken away.
Mm-hmm. And how did everybody end up in Australia?
Yes, that's an even longer story. During the war, the Germans invaded Russia. And when they were in Belarus, there was a German officer who used to bring chickens to my grandmother to cook for him. So my grandmother would pluck all the feathers and she would actually stuff pillowcases with those feathers so that the kids had pillows and things. And they used to get the feet, the beaks and something else where he got most of the meat. And he also brought German shoes for my mum. Then they didn't see him for a while. And the reason that they didn't see him for a while was that every time he got drunk, he would sing Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła.
Oh, okay. So that's the Polish national anthem. For those
he was a Ślązak. Okay. And when the Germans were being pushed out, then they actually offered the women the option of going on the train and working for the same employer as they were working for in Belarus. It didn't work out that way. Mm-hmm. Because once they crossed the border into Germany, they were put into a work camp and then they were moved to another work camp. So my mum used to carry my grandmother's lunch because my grandma was a professional chef. And my grandma would work in the kitchens because she already had that experience. Mm-hmm. And her lunch would then go home. My mum would walk, I think, about 7 kilometres each way to carry my grandma's lunch to feed her 2 siblings and my grandma's younger sister who was a cripple. Mm-hmm. So when the war ended, they again were moved to various places. They went to high school and my mum finished all of her high school within 2 years.
In Germany?
In Germany. Mm-hmm. And there were waiting periods to go to Australia, America, Canada, all of those places. And South America was the only place that would take a widow with children.
Yeah, a single woman, yeah. Mm.
So they signed up for South America and went to Chile.
Is that right?
My grandma's sister got herself engaged to a POW who was a Polish POW that she met in Germany. And he brought her out to Australia. He was working on the Woomera railway project over there. And she sort of wrote back to the family, who were living in Santiago de Chile at the time. And so, you know, you've got to come to Australia. They've got so many opportunities here. It took a few years. It took about 10 years, but they sort of packed up bags and came to Australia on borrowed money, which they then had to repay. So they all went to work and they all worked. My uncle worked for the Snowy Project, and he got a lot of money for that, but the girls both worked for factories.
So it sounds like you, well, firstly, you're very knowledgeable about what happened and what they did. And but there's also, you know, just reading through the lines of what you're saying, there was a lot of trauma there. How did your family cope with all of that?
Well, my uncle was very upset that grandma never hugged him. He needed my grandmother to hug him, his mum. He wanted a hug from his mum, and his mum couldn't, because she had the fear that if she showed softness, she'd break down. She was described as a sweet little old battle axe. Yeah, and even as a kid, then she was very strict in a lot of ways, and she was very demanding. She never ever praised us kids, although she probably was softer with her grandkids than she was with her own kids. But it wasn't until she got dementia and became that child again that she actually found joy. And she found joy in watching a butterfly. She found joy in picking other people's flowers as we were walking along. It was really sweet. You know, dementia is a hard thing for the family, but for the person who's got it, it can actually be a positive thing.
It sounds like, and Anya, through your own career, I know that you've been involved with many different projects, including writing and poetry, and you're also involved in the Polish Museum, radio. How is that all connected? And who are you as a person? Okay, it's a difficult question, but you did say I can ask any questions I want. Because where I'm heading with this, are you a Polish Australian or are you Australian Polish? Who are you?
Yeah, probably more Polish Australian.
Okay.
Because my first love was the Polish culture. And because for me, the very first Australians are the Indigenous peoples of this country. I feel a bit of guilt about the fact that I'm living on land that wasn't ceded. So because my family experienced deportation and they experienced that theft of their properties and all of that, then yeah, it sits on my conscience.
That's so interesting. And it's, you know, the synergies that you're talking about where people have been displaced, they have been essentially kicked out and had to fend for themselves. So I cannot imagine how hard it must have been for your grandmother, you know, 3 children, a sister with a disability, and being sort of in a swirl of war and being thrown around, and then ending up in Chile, I said, and then Australia. You've got to be tough to do all that, no? To be able to survive. You
do. And the women from my grandma's side of the family were always tough. They were stubborn żmudzi.
Aha.
Yeah, so my grandmother's family was mostly Polish-Lithuanian. So when when Mickiewicz says Litwo ojczyzno moja, Lithuania, my homeland,
yes,
then that perfectly described my grandmother's family.
Right. And we do have to have a look at your props because you've brought some. So tell us what did you bring today? Okay,
the first thing I brought, because my dad's family lived in Warsaw, and the surname's Czech, but great-great-grandfather emigrated probably from Moravia a very long time ago, so several generations back, and he would send Polish books over and Polish toys. Amongst them was one of these.
Oh, wow.
This isn't mine from my childhood because mine was well used, and this one is actually in pristine condition.
And
So
Anya, what year do you think this doll was created? Like 70s, 80s, or earlier than that?
it would have been in the 60s.
60s. Wow. And where did you get your doll from? The one that doesn't exist anymore?
I got her from my grandfather, my dad's father. And yeah, so I love dolls. I still collect dolls. When I went to Poland, I came back with a whole lot of the costume dolls, and I wanted some period ones, but I couldn't quite afford all the ones that I wanted. So I had to be very choosy.
Yeah, they can be expensive. And speaking of Poland, how did you find going there? Like how many times have you been? Just the once or more?
The first time I went, I was 8 years old, and I had my 9th birthday in Poland. My dad's brother took me to the Łazienki Castle, to a cafeteria where I had ice cream with advocat topping.
That's pretty special.
It was. I still remember it, but today he would actually be considered to be abusing a child by giving them alcohol.
Yes. Oh, okay.
It wasn't a lot, you couldn't get drunk on it, but it was a marvelous experience because it was like I was this princess. The castle is the most beautiful. The architecture, the decoration, the furnishings of it, and the park around it are really special. And the second time I was in Poland, I was in my mid-20s. I went there in winter, so I didn't visit the castle, but the last time was 2 years ago. And yeah, so my one of my cousins is on my dad's side was a curator at the Warsaw Castle, and he also really loved Łazienki. So several times we'd just go for walks through Łazienki.
It's such a beautiful park, isn't it? So Anya, did you feel at home in Poland when you went?
Very much so. And it was my dad's family who accepted me like we'd always known each other. And we're really close, even though there's quite a lot of difference between us, both age-wise and sort of across the oceans. I think my cousins would be about 10 years older than I am on my father's side. As a child, that made a huge difference. But as an adult, it's like, we're best buds, we're heartmates. It's
yeah. And now that we have Facebook and Zoom and all of that, it's easier to keep in touch. And were you ever able to go back to your ancestral home? Were you ever to go back to Belarus or not?
No, I was planning on it, and I put everything in place. And then I'm a chronic asthmatic with food allergies and intolerances. And on the last day, I went there for the Polish conference, media conference, the very first one that they had. That was an international media conference on account of the 200th anniversary of Poland regaining independence. So I also went to the soldiers conference before that. It was just like a space of about 2 weeks. And then I was going to go for a week to Belarus. And on the last day of the conference, I ate something.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I got really sick.
Right. So I think once COVID's over, maybe we'll yeah. Because I've never been to Ukraine or any of the parts of Poland that are no longer Poland. And I think most people really love it. They, particularly if there's a connection of having your ancestry from there. Anya, what I'm going to do now is ask Sarah to pass on some questions. It's been really fascinating. Thank you for being so generously kind and open about your family history. Sarah, do we have questions for Anya?
Yes, we do. I have a question here. What are some of the ways in which Polish Australians can stay in touch with their roots from here in Australia?
Okay, pączki, pierogi, bigos, the Polish festivals. We used to have some magnificent shell folkloric concerts that were great fun. There was an association of women handcrafters that would gather now Polish scouting, Polish dance groups, and I really have to give a plug to Polonez, because
Yes.
the very first practice of Polonez this year is going to take place on Friday, the 12th of March, and it's going to be at the Lithuanian House in Errol Street, North Melbourne. So the juniors start at 6, intermediate at 7, and seniors at 8. Now, I belong to Polonez. Previously to Polonez, I danced in Syrenka in Sydney.
Did you?
Yeah, so that was my first exposure, and I was 4 years old when I started dancing in Syrenka.
And I think dance is such a connector as well. Now, apart from the food you mentioned, which is the biggest connector, let's face it. But
Yeah.
I think it's such a network building activity where, you know, I know for a fact that people keep in touch for decades after they've danced together. And it's a great activity for children. And at the age of 4 or 5, it's a wonderful way to get involved.
The festivals, the festival at Federation Square and Pole Art festivals are places where people reconnect. People who haven't seen each other in 20, 30 years will meet up at these festivals and reminisce about when they were together as kids and they went to the scout camps, and you know, which were the worst scout camps, and they were often the most popular. The ones where you had to dig your own latrines.
Okay. Well, that's pretty full on. What other questions do we have, Hazara, please?
Yes, I have a question here about culture. As someone who's quite familiar with Polish culture and Australian culture, what would you say is the biggest cultural difference between the two?
Oh, good question.
Oh, the biggest cultural difference. I think it's the way that women are treated. I didn't think that women's lib was necessary, because I lived in a house that was ruled by women.
Yes. That's
so
such
yes.
an interesting point. Yeah. So I you know, just by way of backing you up, when I came to Australia in 1986, I was really quite surprised at how, you know, I don't want to say backwards, but like, yeah, we were equal.
You can say backwards. My mum said backwards, and she said backwards after coming here from South America.
Right. So hopefully we've caught up by now, but who knows? But I think certainly women were well expected to be equal to men. Like there was this egalitarian, I guess, approach to equality. Like you just got on with things. And I think through the history of your own family that you mentioned, how your grandmother, your mom, you just had to get on with things and just do it. And that's all there was to it. There was no fussing and, you know, just do it, right?
Yeah, and we even had a female Polish general. So, you know, there was, okay, you didn't have a lot of women joining the army in Poland, but even historically, there were Polish women in the army who fought alongside the men. A lot of the times the men would go off to war and the women would run everything. So there was a division of labor because, let's face it, men are physically stronger. But because of that, the Polish men were also expected to be gentlemen in the truest sense of that word. They were expected to open the doors. They were expected to give the women the best that there was on the table. They were expected to serve their wives. At least in my family, they were.
Interesting. And there was the hand kissing, which you still sometimes get when you go to Poland from older gentlemen, which, to a lot of people is a bit strange. But that's I still think that there are a section of Polish society that's really formal, and you know, you would certainly never address anybody by their first name. So there was that level of formality and respect, I guess, that would be expected, as you said. Absolutely. Anya, guess what? Our half an hour's over, but I am so thankful for you spending this half an hour with us. We got watched by quite a few people. Hi, everyone. We've got, I'm just going to say hello to a few people. Jeffrey, Patricia, and even Estelle from Sydney. But it's been an amazing journey, I guess, the way you've described it, your family coming out here and then bringing up Polish. And I found it really interesting that you said that you're more Polish Australian than Australian Polish, because that's about identity and who we are. So let's hope, I don't know, later this year, next year, we can travel, you know, to Poland. I know I'm hanging out, and maybe this summer around you can also make it to where your family comes from.
Belarus.
What's the name of the town again? Tell us again the name of the town.
Cianorzątki.
Okay, we're not going to get people to try and pronounce it because it's a tough one. But on that note, thank you so very much for spending your afternoon with us. Really appreciate it, Anya.
You're welcome. I hope to see you again.
We will. Thank you.